You may have seen the blackout technique done many ways. You may have tried it yourself with ink blending, but have you tried it with watercoloring? Today, I'm going to be showing you this 3D embossing folder technique that is called Watercolor Blackout. This is going to be where we are watercoloring the background, and then we're going to put black ink over the top to really make everything pop. This technique may get a little messy and inky and may even look like a total disaster, but trust me, the end results are going to just blow you away. This technique can be done with any type of embossing folder or even a 2D embossing folder. What I recommend is just grab what you have and give it a try. Hi everyone, I'm Mindy Eggen and welcome to my channel. Now the embossing folder that I picked out for today is called Poinsettia Jubilee from Simon Says Stamp. One of the reasons I picked this embossing folder is because of the poinsettia images, so I could color those in. I'm also going to be using some watercolor paper. One of the reasons I chose the watercolor paper is because I'm going to be adding quite a bit of water to this, and I knew that this would hold up to it. This happens to be loose watercolor paper from Altenew. I believe it is a 5x7. You're going to see that once I place it in my embossing folder, it is going to hang off the edges, which is perfectly fine. Now, at this point in the technique, it really doesn't matter which side is which. All you need to do is place your cardstock in there. I did happen to spritz mine a little bit with some water to help soften the fibers. I'm going to be using my Gina K Designs Intri-Cut machine. I have the top dial set at 3D emboss. The bottom dial I think I tightened it to -3. And then I'm just using the main platform and the folder and running that through. You may notice that it can have a little bit of curving at the edges, which is totally fine because I'm going to be trimming this down. So I have a beautifully embossed panel, but what I want is the back side. I want the flowers that are, what is that called, debossed into that paper. Now, my paper is already a little damp because I spritzed it before I ran it through the machine, but I still added some water using my distress sprayer to really have some movement to my watercolor. I happen to be using these watercolor brushes, but you can use a watercolor pan set. You can use re-inkers. I say just give it a try. Any type of liquid form or your watercolor pan sets, see what happens. In full disclosure, I did not think this was going to work. This was where I wanted to try this technique and I decided to hit record in case it turned out. So throughout this, I'm really experimenting. I tried to keep most of my card, the rest of the design fairly simple. And then later on, I'll come back with maybe some more embossing folders and step them up to add different elements to them. Some of the areas and images can get a little hard to define, so I brought in the embossing folder and flipped it over so that it looks just like the area I'm working on, and I'm using that as a guide. So every now and then I'll come in and spritz some more water down, and all that's doing is helping move the watercolor. You're going to see some areas are a little more wet than others, so it's really wicking out. And it is okay if your color kind of goes past the image that you're coloring in, because that is where the blackout technique is really going to come in handy and hide our imperfections. So I did speed this up a little bit, but I kept in the entire process so you can see exactly what I was doing, which, like I said, I really wasn't 100% sure what I was doing. I just knew that I wanted to color these in. I wanted to try something different other than ink blending. And doing the watercoloring with this, there is a lot of forgiveness because we're going to be covering, like I said, that background with our black ink. I have done a similar technique that I will have linked at the end of this video. And that is kind of a modified blackout technique where instead of black ink, I had used a dark color of ink. Now I'm switching over to green, and this is where things can get a little out of control because if green mixes with the red, you're obviously going to get a brown. I am being very careful. You can see where my berries are. It looks like a total mess. Everything is wicking out. Uh, and even though it looked pretty much like a disaster at this point, and even in another step here, I'm going with it because I figured if nothing else, I'm going to learn from this process. So I'm continuing on. Some of the area I really didn't need to fill in with that green because the black ink is going to cover it. But what I was trying to attempt here was there are some debossed lines that are just a little bit deeper into the paper than what I could really see. So by just filling all of that in, I'm hoping that those deep areas kind of catch the green ink, which they did. So I'm glad I did go through the entire background. Now, some of my flowers, because they are still wet, my green is wicking into those petals, but I will clean that up later. And if nothing else, like I said, I figured this was going to go with experimenting and figuring out where I may have gone wrong or what I could change differently for next time. But in all honesty, I'm okay when my red and green kind of mix a little bit like that. If it's not too much, I feel like it adds a little bit of interest to the flowers. Now, I did come in with a paper towel and I dabbed that up a little bit. And a key thing here is you want to make sure that this background is completely dry before we move on to the next step. So I am using my Ranger heat tool, just going to go across and make sure that's nice and dry. And then I will kind of work the paper to flatten that out a little bit. I don't want to run this through a die cut machine to flatten it because then I will lose all of that embossed area. So yes, at this point, it looks like a total disaster, but now we're going to see where the magic really happens. So I am taking my Versafine clear ink and I'm going to drag this down the front of the card. I'm trying to keep my ink pad as flat as I can with the cardstock and letting that hit the embossed areas where all of my cardstock is raised, which is going to be kind of those solid areas in between the flowers, and it's also catching the detail of the flowers. Now, one tip that I do have for you is make sure your ink pad is either just re-inked right before or maybe a brand new ink pad, something that's nice and juicy because mine, I've definitely used it many a times. It's on the drier side. I brought out my Simon Says Stamp Versafine Clair because that's fairly new. And I also kind of go in circular motions to try and catch as much of the cardstock as I can. Watercolor paper is really textured, so you may not even get everything. And I think that's still a really great look. So I am going to use my paper trimmer to trim this down. So I'm going to trim it to 4¼ by 5½. And with a Versafine ink, it does stay wet for a while, especially since I added so much ink. And I got my paper trimmer pretty dirty. So I just sprayed a little bit of rubbing alcohol on a paper towel and kind of slid that underneath that, um, what is it, like a protective guard to get rid of that ink so it doesn't ruin my next project. I'm going to use a sentiment from the Heartfelt Snowflakes stamp set. I thought this font would be beautiful with this type of card since it is a pretty dramatic card. And I'm going to keep this simple. I'm just going to stamp this in black ink onto white cardstock. I hadn't used this sentiment before, so I kind of rubbed it with my hand a little bit. And then I brought out these conditioning erasers from Altenew. I just rubbed over the stamp and then I'm going to wipe that down with a tidy towel. That way it's going to accept ink a lot better. A couple ideas I had with this that I was very tempted to do was heat emboss the sentiment in maybe a gold embossing powder. I think that would have been beautiful. But again, I tend to get carried away. I really, really had to hold myself back from adding splatter to the background. Again, I didn't want to take away from the card front. As much as I love splatter, I really wanted to focus on the technique and the design that it left behind. Now again, because I stamped it in that Versafine Clair ink, which stays wet for a little while, I'm going to dry the sentiment with my heat tool. And then I'm using the coordinating dies and my Spellbinder's Best Ever Craft tape to hold that in place and run that through my die cut machine. As usual, I like to die cut out at least two more so I can layer them together, especially since these are pretty delicate and small areas. By layering them up together like this with some liquid glue helps build the dimension to them versus fussing with any type of foam square. And the liquid glue I'm using today is the Gina K Designs Connect glue. I have it in a large bottle and I just pour it into the fine tip bottle. I have a side folding card base, and to attach my embossed panel, I am going to use some foam tape. Some double-sided adhesive sheets would work really well for this too. I did add quite a bit of foam tape, so thankfully, or hopefully, I should say, I can find it on sale this weekend since there are a lot of great Black Friday sales happening right now at the current time of this video. So I went ahead and attached my card front to that card base, and I'm bringing out my small T-square ruler to help align my sentiment straight on the front of the card. So I know exactly where I'm going to place the word Mary, and I have that attached with the liquid glue on the back. Using my ruler to keep that straight, I will place something heavy on it for a few seconds and then just shift my ruler down and add the word Christmas underneath, trying to keep everything centered as much as I can. I did decide to come in with a few embellishments. These are the Butter Dazzling Gems from Simon Says Stamp. I'm going to put three towards the top and three towards the bottom of my sentiment just to add a little bit of sparkle. I couldn't resist all of my usual habits with my card project, so I did decide to add some of those gems. And again, I'm just going to attach them with some liquid glue. And I have one of these waxy tipped pickup tools. Mine need to be cleaned, so once they are cleaned, they pick up jewels beautifully. Now, again, I do have a similar video where I kind of did a spin on this using a dark ink instead of black ink. And that one, I believe I did ink blending. So I will link that here at the end of the video. Be sure to head over and check that out. I'm going to have all of my supplies linked down below in the video description and over on my blog as well. This was a really fun technique to experiment with, and I hope you give it a try as well.